lovely to welcome all of you here. It's great to see so many old, so many new faces. And we've got a wonderful lineup of talks in this seminar series, and I'll talk a little bit more about what is coming at the end of today's talk. But right now, I would like to welcome our first speaker for this seminar season, and that is Kat Almeida-Warren, who is a Leverhulme Elderly Career Fellow at the University of Oxford. She's a primate archaeologist, and she is specifically interested in work on the intersection of archaeology, primatology, and evolutionary anthropology, in particular, primate tool use and culture. And her work is in a very relevant way, done in Tanzania's Gombe Stream National Park, so the same place where Jane Goodall has done her work, and also Guinea's Bushu Forest. And Kat, on top of all of this, is a National Geographic explorer and a member of the IUCN Working Group for Chimpanzee Cultures. So, without further ado, let's welcome Kat Almeida-Warren.
Yes. Thank you, Joanna, and thank you, Chris, for the invitation to come and give a talk to the mammals group here at Oxford. I'm hoping to give you sort of a broad overview of some of the research I do, but trying to contextualize that into sort of broader things about chimpanzee culture and primate archaeology. So I hope I'll have something new, exciting, and maybe surprising for you today. It's wonderful to get the chance to speak in a venue with so much history, and it seemed fitting. Back. Here we go. It seemed fitting to start this talk with an acknowledgement of sort of one of the great giants of animal research, but also chimpanzees particularly. A lot of the work that Jane Goodall did in her early years, especially with the termite fishing, is what led to a lot of the work that I do today. And aside from being a scientist and a really important advocate for chimpanzees and nature worldwide, she really saw humans as part of nature and not apart from nature. And it's with that sort of idea that I also would like to invite you to think about culture as a species inclusive definition. So something that's not unique to humans, but something that's sort of along these lines is kind of a broadly accepted definition for animal behaviorists. It's a behavior and knowledge that is acquired and passed on within and between generations. So very broad. It talks a little bit about knowledge being passed on, but one definition that I particularly like is the way we do things, the way we collectively do things. Now, as many of you I'm sure know, culture wasn't something that has been sort of known or thought of as being something that belonged to animals for a really long time. It's only actually been in my, since I've been alive, that culture has been part of this kind of conversation. And so much so that also when Jane first went to Gombe to study chimpanzees, and she saw David Greybeard inserting a long stick into a termite mound to fish for termites, we, or the wide scientific community, thought that technology and tool use was also unique to humans. And when she saw this and she wrote to her mentor, Louis Leakey, he famously replied, "Now we must redefine tool, redefine man, or accept chimpanzees as humans." Just going to scroll down a bit just so I know what I'm doing. So culture is widely recognized in a range of animals throughout the world and throughout different taxonomic groups. Whale song, the way different bee communities kind of create their nests, so different architectural traditions in how they build these kind of honeycombs. Of course, matriarch elephants and how they pass on the knowledge of different feeding grounds, all the way down to how killer whales or orcas coordinate hunting strategies, and which passes on from sort of mother to the next generation, to our own sort of blue tits, who were known, at least when we still got our milk bottles on the doorstep, that learned to kind of open the the silver tops and get the milk inside. And all of these things we define and think about as culture because it's something that's become part of those different communities. But chimpanzees still remain one of the species that has the broadest and most comprehensive range of most comprehensive range of cultural repertoire. And that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today. And I don't know if it's okay. Did that work? No. Excellent. So chimpanzees range across sort of this kind of middle part of the African continent, all the way from West Africa and then sort of patches through sort of Central Africa, all the way to sort of Tanzania and the most eastern part. Now, it's thought that at some point in the distant past, these communities would have all been linked by a continuous band of forest. However, sort of historical climate change, changes in landmass, but then also more recent changes have kind of led to these patchwork of different habitats, which has also led to this sort of speciation of 4 different chimpanzee subspecies. So we have these main ones, the Western chimpanzees, Central, Eastern, and then we also have bonobos, which are, of course, another species, sister species to chimpanzees, who have their own suite of behaviors and culture. And of course, because of these different communities also live in a range of different habitats, from sort of open savannas to very sort of montane forests, to the traditional kind of rainforest habitats, to sort of many communities now live at what we call a human primate interface, which is where they're sort of living very close to human villages or human communities, which adds a different dynamic to their adaptations and the behaviors that they acquire. Now, connected to kind of this environmental diversity, but also sort of individual variations, we have this very broad range of cultural diversity. Now, I'm not going to explain you this picture. This is just to give you an idea of kind of the different behaviors that different communities have. And this is only mainly differences between Western chimpanzees and Eastern chimpanzees. And one sort of interesting thing for me, which is also connected to kind of what I study, is that Eastern chimpanzees, including sort of the chimpanzees in Gombe, which Jane Goodall studied, do termite fishing and are best known for that. And then Western chimpanzees also do termite fishing, but they are best known for nut cracking. And this is something that Eastern chimpanzees do not do, even though nuts and stone tools, or the materials that they use to crack nuts, are available in those landscapes. This is kind of a striking difference. And as Joanna alluded to, I've been fortunate to study both these species in different areas. So Gombe in Tanzania, but also Bosu in Guinea. And I'll talk a little bit through this talk about the different things I've learned from them, including some additional research from colleagues and other people. Okay. So we talked a little bit about cultural diversity, but I want to, and I'll go into that a little bit later, but I wanted to kind of give a deep dive of sort of the culture and the chimpanzees of Bosu. This is the community that I studied the most. I studied them throughout my PhD and now during sort of my postdoctoral research. The Bosu chimpanzees have been studied for over 50 years. It was a research site established by the Japanese Primate Research Institute in collaboration with local researchers. And this community, through these decades of research, has uncovered they have a rich cultural heritage, which includes 20 different forms of tool use, but also other forms of cultural behaviors in terms of the gestures they use to communicate, and many other things. And another thing about the Bosu chimpanzees, and one of the reasons why a lot of chimpanzees in this area have been there for a long time, as opposed to some other sites where there might be falling victims of poaching, is because this chimpanzee community has cultural significance to the local human culture. The Manon, which is an animist community who lives very close to the chimpanzees. For them, the chimpanzees are their ancestors and therefore they are protected. And there's a lot of rich cultural traditions and history between the humans and the chimpanzees that share this habitat. Now, going through just some of the rich culture that this community has, this is sort of an example of nut cracking. I hope you can hear, maybe, if I can turn that up. Okay. So basically, they're using a stone hammer and a stone anvil to crack this. To crack these, actually, they're oil palm nuts, but some other communities crack different nut species as well. And here it's very nice. You see a little infant peering at her mother and trying to figure out what's going on, maybe get a nut. And this is, I'm not going to talk about this too much about our talk, but sort of studying this behavior, this peering behavior, has been really insightful for understanding mechanisms of learning, both in primates, but also how our ancestors may have learned from each other as well. Okay, the other thing that they do a lot, especially in certain seasons, is this ant dipping. And you can see this is Fanwa. He's stripping the leaves from a long twig and then inserting it into a termite mound. Next to him is another male chimpanzee also trying to get his share of the ants. And the crazy thing is that these ants are incredibly horrible because they bite like hell. They're not pleasant. You get them on you and I've had big welts because of getting bitten by them. So what they do is they try and eat them as quickly as possible by sort of getting them off the tool with their hand and try and slipping them off to stop them from biting them themselves. But somehow they are incredibly delicious for them. I don't know why, but you'll be here, at least this particular one, which I took last year. They were there for a good hour just harvesting these ants. And they also love eating the eggs as well from the nests. Okay, this other one, which is one of my favorite ones, because it's not one that's seen in very many places, is algae scooping. So they're sort of using these twigs, which is slightly different, the sort of flexible sticks to harvest these algae that sort of grow in standing water ponds. We're not entirely sure why they do this, possibly because of their nutritional value of the algae. It could also be another way to stay hydrated because they often do this in the drier season, but we're not entirely sure. So we need to do some research to kind of look at why or how they do it. Okay, buttress drumming is something that Bosu chimpanzees do, but a lot of other chimpanzee communities do as well. This is a way that they communicate to individuals in their environment. And hopefully you can hear JJ. I'll be quiet for a minute because it's quite nice. So this behavior is, as I said, connected to communication. We think it might be to indicate sort of where they are, so to call to the other individuals. They're somewhere else in the forest saying, "Here I am, come join me, let's go to the feeding tree nearby." There's lots of recent research indicating that they selectively choose the best trees to make the sound. So not all trees are good to sort of drum on. So they choose the best sounding trees, but they also pick locations which are maybe crossroads in their paths. So it's kind of a way of networking, but also for other chimps to know where is that tree and being able to find it. So it's sort of sound, but also location beacon, if you were. Yes.
Very sorry to interrupt you. Is it possible to turn on the lights?
Oh, yes. Thank you, Chris. Yeah, I think he's doing that now. Great. Thanks for pointing that out. So that was just a very small window of sort of what Bosu chimpanzees get up to. I would love to talk more and more about it, but I also want to talk a little bit about sort of just give you some examples of the chimpanzee cultural diversity I was talking to you about earlier. So what I'm going to show you here is in the top is, oh, sorry. Let me mute that. Sorry, that was, I'll mute that now because we don't need sound. So in the top right corner there, you see the chimpanzee of Bossou doing some algae fishing, and that's a site in Guinea. Again, down here, we have another site in Guinea, Bakun, but they're using a really, really long stick. I think it's about, if I remember correctly, it's like 4 meters long. It's something ridiculous. But so different ways of harvesting algae, possibly because of the depth of the ponds, all of these things. But then this one here, which we didn't really get to look at, so I'll play that again quickly, is, come on. Yeah, is, this is actually in, okay. This is in East Africa. This is in Tanzania. This is not Gombe chimpanzees, but it's a site very close by where they just do it with their hands. And it's possible, we don't know for sure, but we think that it's possibly because this site is a much more arid environment. And chimpanzees are actually normally quite water phobic, so they do not like touching water or being in water, which probably explains why those two are doing that. But because it's so arid, and we know from sites like Fongoli, where it is extremely arid, very, very hot, chimps do get into water to stay cool. So this could be just, you know, they like the coolness in this case because it's actually a way to stay cool and thermoregulate, and therefore they've just got the algae with their hands and don't need to use tools. But yeah, some interesting cultural variation. But cultural variation doesn't only extend to differences in tool use. We also have differences in grooming hand clasps. This is something that chimpanzees do when they're grooming each other. They will hold their hands in different ways. So some communities will do this palm to palm, where they're sort of clasping their hands like this, like holding hands. And then the other one where they sort of touch their wrists. And these are different both within communities, between communities in the same area, so the same population, the same forest, different communities in that forest will do different things, but also between populations, they might also have these different handshakes. Or that's what the sort of the press has called it, their own special handshake, and I quite like that. And there's a lot we still have to learn and study about chimpanzees, but the main reason why I am interested, or I have studied chimpanzees, is because of what they can shed light about our earliest origins. So chimpanzees are our closest living relatives, along with bonobos, of course. And we share a last common ancestor, so that's a great-great-great-great-grandparent, around 8 million years ago. And this sounds like a long time. And we've sort of both our lineages have evolved during this period. However, the molecular and fossil evidence suggests that our common ancestor was morphologically most similar to chimpanzees. So understanding and studying behaviors in chimpanzees and those similarities with our behaviors as well can give us kind of can shed light on what our earliest ancestors were up to, especially when we go back to our sort of common ancestor. So what kind of behaviors we were doing, what were their lives like? Because it's quite hard, me being an archaeologist as well by training, there's only so much you can tell from the archaeology, which when you go that far back in time, 3 million years ago, 8 million years ago, most of what you have are fossils and stone tools. So over the last several decades, studying chimpanzees in this sort of human evolution context has helped researchers tackle questions that could answer a range of things. Some examples include what set us on the path for upright walking. So what are the contexts in which chimpanzees walk bipedally, and how can that help us understand why we started walking on 2 legs? But also, how do chimpanzees interact with each other and build a community? What are the origins of communication? How did we go to sort of verbal, grammatical, structured speaking? What did we do before? And then how did we learn from each other? So this is this classic peering behavior. In terms of tool use, we may have learned from each other as well as locations, feeding locations, all of these different things. And finally, which is kind of what my research has mostly been focused on, in sort of what were the origins of technology. And so studying chimpanzees as models for early origins have actually gained a newfound significance, especially in the early 2000s when following and basically an archaeologist decided to go and excavate a chimpanzee nutcracking site, one that chimpanzees weren't using anymore. And through that excavation, they found some charcoal remains, and they were able to date it to 4,300 years ago. This basically means that chimpanzees were cracking nuts since the human Bronze Age, or at the time that some of the pyramids were built. And this was really important because this showed that chimpanzees could produce a durable archaeological record, which before we didn't know. We didn't know that their material remains could leave a record that dated this far. And this discovery led to the establishment of a field called primate archaeology, which basically had the objective to bring new perspectives for the origins and evolution of technology. Now, primate archaeology, to what it is a bit of a strange concept maybe for many of you, but what it does is it combines archaeological methods with animal behavior techniques to study non-human primate technology and culture. So some of the methods include things like behavioral observation, so following the chimpanzees on a day-to-day basis, recording their behavior, ecological surveys, understanding the landscape in which they live, but also doing excavations like the archaeologists had done previously, mapping their sort of the use of their landscape, but also doing experiments with materials, which I'll talk a little bit further on, and also doing analyses on the stones themselves, things like use-wear analysis and other things that archaeologists do a lot, especially those studying tools. But one of the greatest assets of primate archaeology is because it enables to study how behavior might translate into an archaeological record. This is something that we don't know in our distant past. We have the archaeology and don't know how it was made, but with the chimpanzees, we have the behavior and we can see how that is being made in real time. So to give a little context of what we know, at least in terms of our own, or what we know currently of the early Stone Age and our technological origins, is we know so far that we have stone tools dating back to 3.3 million years ago. These were used by and made by some of our earliest ancestors. And we don't really have anything before that. And I'll go back to why this may be in a minute. But these different technologies which go, and then sort of from the Stone Age, we go to Bronze Age, Iron Age, and so on. But what happens with these three, or one feature that unifies all of these stone technologies is that they are intentional products. So they're an intentional production of tools with sharp convex angles. And what this means, of course, at least in terms of for archaeologists, is that a lot of archaeologists think that because they were intentionally produced, then maybe they weren't the first tools that our ancestors would have used. Most researchers now predict that they may have started off with using sharp flakes that were produced through natural processes, trampling, animal trampling, and so on, or potentially accidentally through the use of unmodified stones used for accessing encased food, something like nuts and bone marrow and so on. And this is what we see in chimpanzee nutcracking, which I'll talk to a little bit later. Now, this is kind of what we predict. What we also can learn from studying at least the tools that we do have from the archaeological record is that our ancestors at that time did have a number of sort of cognitive and behavioral abilities. One that we can understand is that they had knowledge of the mechanical properties of the materials that they used. So they knew what were the best materials to use to make these sharp edges, which meant that they were also selective of the materials. So they weren't just picking any old rock. They knew which ones were best. They were discarding others, but there's also some variation between different communities. We also know in some cases that they were transporting these materials for a really, really long distance. So they might not have just been picking up what was close by. If they really, really like a specific type of material, maybe it was pretty, maybe it was just really good at doing what they wanted to do, then they might travel a long way to do it. Which has some implications in terms of planning and also spatial cognition in terms of navigating the landscape and so on. And finally, technocultural diversity, the archaeological evidence suggests there's lots of different variations in these different records. But as I said, we don't think this was the earliest form of tool use used by our ancestors. So one of the questions that myself and others have been looking at is, are these characteristics something that developed when we started making stone tools, or did they occur afterwards? So maybe as far back as our common ancestor with chimpanzees. So one way to answer this was by looking at chimpanzee nutcracking. As I said before, chimpanzee nutcracking does have this kind of characteristic of, is a form of processing a hard-shelled resource. In this case, most often it's an anvil, a stone anvil and hammer that is used to crack a hard-shelled nut. And during this stone-on-stone impact, so when they're hitting a stone on the stone, it produces some fragments with sharp edges, which may be one of the ways that our ancestors may have started using these sharp tools and then made them themselves. We also have evidence of nutcracking as far back as 780,000 years ago in a site in the Levant, so the Middle East area. So that suggests that at least our nearer ancestors, and probably very far back, would have been processing things like nuts, because also they have high fat content, high nutrients, and so on. So it would have been an important resource potentially to our earliest ancestors. So one of the first bits of research that was done through primary archaeology was looking at this chimpanzee nutcracking and looking at whether they were selecting or not specific materials. So what happened, this was in Bosu. I didn't do this research, but it was at the site that I studied at. And some researchers brought a bunch of different stone materials. All of these have different properties in terms of hardness and their resistance to breakage, which means that they have sort of these different properties, so different levels of resistance. And so these stones were left in a sort of clearing in the forest with a supply of nuts that was replenished kind of every week or so. And they just left it there for the chimpanzees to come and go as they pleased. And what we found was chimpanzees did choose the best suited raw materials. They weren't just picking, they were picking dacite, which doesn't really matter what it is, but it's sort of for hammers. And then this other rock for anvils. And what was interesting was that the hammer choice was a much harder resistant material, whilst this carbonatite, the anvil choice, was a much softer material that wore more easily. And what it turned out was that this kind of material would leave this kind of little divot in the rock where the nut would nestle into. And actually, chimpanzees preferred this kind of stone, not because it was just softer, but also ones that already had this little trace, because it gave it a little place to nestle the nut. So when they were cracking it, the nut wouldn't just go flying off, and they'd have to go and retrieve it. So having this little hole in the sort of anvil and having this softer stone enabled was sort of a technical adaptation and advantage to kind of make their nut cracking more efficient and keep the nut in place while they were cracking it. And we see patterns of raw material preference, so preference to different stone materials at many different sites where nut cracking happens. But interestingly, we also have at the nearby site of the Thai forest, that's in the Ivory Coast, researchers discovered that each of the three communities that crack nuts there actually use different materials to crack them. And they use different materials. So in some communities used only stone tools, some communities used stone and wooden tools. And it was found out they were using different materials, they were using different techniques because of the materials sort of offered different properties, which also had an impact on the efficiency of those communities. So some communities were cracking nuts better than others effectively. Even though these materials are present throughout the forest, so it wasn't like one community had access to want some materials more than others. And what was more intriguing is, and you may not know this, but generally in chimpanzee communities, it's the female chimpanzees that migrate to another community to reproduce and have offspring and so on. But when females migrated to a different group, they adopted the local technique and the local material, even though their nutcrack efficiency might be compromised. So even if they came from a group that was quite efficient, or the most efficient group at cracking nuts, when they went to a different community, they adopted the tradition of the community that they were bringing into. And this suggests that this strong sort of cultural fidelity and conformity might indicate that for chimpanzees and maybe even our ancestors, belonging to a social group might be more beneficial than maximizing your individual sort of foraging efficiency. So being part of that community and being integrated in that, in some cases, especially here, maybe their sort of goal as opposed to necessarily being the best at nutcracking. So we looked mainly so far at sort of the tools themselves, so very fine scale, looking at the raw materials that they were choosing. But studying nutcracking can also give us some clues on how stone tool sites form. And this was some of the research that I did as part of my PhD in Bossou. And basically, the Bossou forest is littered with nutcracking trees. There are nutcracking trees everywhere. I can't remember the numbers, but we did a survey and we found something like 500 nutcracking trees just by surveying some parts of the forest. So that's a lot of nutcracking trees. However, only 42, we only found only 42 nutcracking sites, so the ones here in red. So it's evident that chimpanzees were not cracking nuts at any nut tree that they found, and also not any nut tree that had the available stone materials. So we were trying to look at what other things in the environment might be affecting where they were cracking nuts and the frequency in which they were cracking nuts in those places. And what we found is that nut cracking occurred predominantly in areas with a high concentration of resources, such as seasonal, spatially predictable fruit trees, like this fig tree here that Fanley is munching on, but also locations of good nesting sites, so places where they will sleep. And we know from lots of research, both in Bossou and other sites, that chimpanzees tend to sleep in the same areas, and sometimes they might even reuse the same nests or rebuild nests over others. So there's kind of a preference for certain areas to nest, and they're also looking at places to eat, and fruit is one of their favorite foods, basically, even though they might eat some other things. And what this suggests is that these resource-rich areas are acting as sort of an ecological tether. So they're doing these different activities, and that is where this nut cracking is happening. So these other activities are shaping the movement and foraging patterns of the Bossou chimpanzees. Which then leads to the establishment of these very specific nutcracking sites in specific areas, which are repeatedly used over and over again, some of them over 10 to 20 years as well. And this gives us some important insights into the sort of the broader environment and activity patterns that shaped tool use in our early ancestors, and by extension, the formation of archaeological sites that we excavate today. So not just looking at the stone tools themselves, but looking at how those relate to broader activities and behaviors that our ancestors may have engaged in, but we aren't able to reconstruct from the archaeology alone. But did we just use stone tools? So possibly, and many researchers now think this might be the case for several lines of evidence, which I'll go through in a minute, is potentially before we started using stone tools, maybe we were actually using plant tools. The evidence for plant tool use, as you can imagine, archaeologically is actually very rare. But just in the last 5 years or so, we've found some really amazing, really well-preserved things like grass bedding dated to 20,000 years ago, found in South Africa, in a cave in South Africa. We also have these sort of digging sticks that we know were modified, so they were sharpened. This was found in China very recently, so just this year, dated to 300,000 years ago. And we also have even older, almost 500,000 years ago, remains of a potential wooden structure. So maybe a sort of a rudimentary building or something that was found in Namibia, I think, somewhere in Southern Africa at least. However, even though we have this sort of some amazing finds. It is still rare, but we know that under the right conditions, so anoxic conditions, things where organic remains do not get destroyed, we know that organic remains are 20 times more common than stones. So actually, through this line of evidence, it suggests that probably we're missing a lot archaeologically from a lot of the sites. We mostly find the stuff that lasts a long time and not much of the organic remains. And we also know that chimpanzees, they use stone tools for nut cracking. They use stones for a few other things, but not much. But when we look at their plant tool use, it's a lot and everywhere. So we showed you sort of the ant fishing, about the termite fishing, but they also used sticks to dig for tubers. There are some cases of chimpanzees using sharpened sticks to hunt for bush babies. They make leaves, or they make sponges out of leaves or moss to get water from tree holes. They also use sticks to harvest honey and many, many more things. But they also, on a daily basis, are in contact with plants, both for sort of building a nest every night, but they also use plants for personal hygiene, so things like leaf napkins to clean themselves. And more recently, one of my PhD colleagues did her research on this, is we know now that they use plants for self-medication. So they specifically use plants which have medicinal properties to treat different things, tummy bugs, treat wounds and other things. These plants have certain bioactive properties that are associated to having these health benefit impacts. So plants are part of the everyday chimpanzee life, and we think very likely this is also part of our own, of the life of our earliest ancestors. So to understand this a bit more, understand what our early plant tool use might have been like, we can look at chimpanzee termite fishing. And of course, this is the research that Jane Goodall sort of started in a way. And it is one of the most widespread forms of chimpanzee technology, much more so than nutcracking. And we know that the contemporary human communities do eat termites and harvest them when it's termite season. And they have nutritional benefits. They're high in protein, they're high in fat. So there is a lot of, similar to nuts, there is a lot of benefit that you can get from them. But we also have some archaeological evidence of termite mounds being preserved close to sites associated to our earliest ancestors. Now I'm going to show you just a short clip of sparrows. This is a chimpanzee from Gombe. She was about 56 at the time that I recorded this. Sadly, she passed away a few years ago, but she's one of the most experienced termite fishing, was one of the most experienced termite fishing chimpanzees in Gombe. She taught many of her offspring and relatives to termite fish. And what you see here is she's actually collecting new materials for fishing for termites. So she's sort of picking a few different things. And she's bringing them back to the mound. She puts them in her mouth. She's checking out a new spot, which didn't seem very good. So then she goes back to her original place and starts. And here again, similar to what we saw with the ant dipping, she's stripping this thin probe from leaves, and then she's inserting it. And you can sort of see that she's using, maybe in the next one, but she's sort of, when she inserts the tool, she's kind of paying really close attention to how it's feeling in the mound. As I cut off the video there a little bit because it was getting quite long. But just by observing this, I hope you can kind of see that there are lots of elements in terms of, picking raw materials, but also curating them when she brings them to the mound, sort of picking the ones that she wants to use, trimming them as she's fishing. So kind of very intimate knowledge of both the materials that she's using, but also the behavior of the termites and the termite mound. So we wanted to look a little bit more into these different things. So this raw material sourcing, where they were getting the materials from, were they picking any specific materials as chimpanzees do for nutcracking? And also looking at the tools themselves that they were discarding next to the mound. So for this research, myself and a colleague, we looked at 3 different sites, including the Gombe Stream National Park there up ahead, and 2 neighboring sites, Isa Valley and Mahale Mountains. We know that there's historic gene flow between these 3 communities, even though they're now completely isolated. But we also have sort of slightly different habitat characteristics, as you can see. So Gombe is kind of a very mixed habitat of mostly sort of rainforest, but also some mountainous areas, all the way down to Isa Valley, which is, you can't really tell from this picture, but it is quite arid. This is the site where they were fishing for the algae with their hands, to a really mountainous area in the Mahale Mountains. Very, very dense jungle, hard to kind of get to the different termite mounds. So the first thing we were looking at was species selection. We were able to do this by, if I can point, yes, identifying basically the scars left on the plants from the removals of these tools. In some cases here, just to give you an example, we can match the tool to the place where it came from. And this was how we were able to basically identify the different species they were getting the tools from. And at all 3 sites, Mahale, Gombe, and Isa, it was clear that they were favoring a subset of available species. So they weren't only picking any plant that was near the mound. There were certain species they were picking. Sometimes, even from the same tree, they were maybe collecting 20, 30 tools over time. So some of these is just, you can see there's 4 scars on this one, but there were some with a lot more. And interestingly, all of them, even though some of the species were different between sites, they were all from a similar family as well, which is kind of an interesting thing that we looked into a bit later. Then we looked at material selection. So in terms of what plant parts were they using? And this, where things got a bit interesting, is that we had at all 3 sites, you can see sort of the red shading here, twigs were basically the most abundant material and the sort of the most twigs in the sense that they would be good and useful to harvest termites. However, when we look at then Isa and Mahale, they only used bark tools, which was quite surprising, given that, you know, just the site a few kilometers away, they were using both twig and bark, and there was no particular preference. And we thought, well, maybe bark is better than twig, or maybe twigs aren't just very good. But then we tried doing this ourselves. This is with a twig, and we had got all of these termites. So I was like, okay, it seems twig doesn't seem to be the issue here, at least when we tried it ourselves. And so this means, or we thought that potentially this is a cultural variant of these 2 communities, that for some reason they just really like using bark for termite fishing, which is even, and we think this as well because they do use, for example, Isa chimpanzees do use twigs for harvesting other social insects. They just don't use them for termites. So given that there's not much of an ecological explanation, we think that, again, as I said, that this could be a cultural variant. And we looked to this, well, not me, but my colleague looked at this even a little bit further by using some sort of very fancy sort of scientific experiments. So measuring, as you would with the stone tools, measuring the kind of physical properties of these different tool materials. And what they found was that actually these different materials, so twigs and bark, exhibit different properties. Bark is more flexible, of course. Twigs, not so much. But the plant species that they were using produced more flexible probes than the species that they never used. But on top of that, which kind of comes back to our bark preference, is that bark materials were the most flexible and enabled chimpanzees basically to get through the sort of windy tunnels of the termites. So this probably is a hyper-specialization of these 2 communities, that they realized that bark for this specific task was the best tool for it. And they developed that tradition, whilst the Gombe chimpanzees still use sort of the different materials that are available. Now, this specialization for bark then also means that there are different strategies for sourcing these materials. because in the case of ESA, at least, bark was the least available. So it meant that chimpanzees in ESA not only had to travel further to get the materials, so further away from the mound, up to 35 meters or so, they also sourced the plants closest to the mound a lot more than the other two sites. And this is likely, again, so these strategies are not only linked to their sort of cultural preference, but also to the environmental context. The twigs, the bark is less available, so they have to kind of travel further, which drives this sort of variation in how far they travel and where the sort of evidence of this sourcing is, basically. So what does this mean? So from looking, we sort of looked briefly at chimpanzee nutcracking and chimpanzee termite fishing, and we know from sort of our earliest evidence of tools, we know that our earliest ancestors had engineering knowledge, raw material selection, and technocultural diversity. And we know that nutcracking chimpanzees also have these traits, as do now termite fishing chimpanzees. So what this means potentially is that these three behaviors are part of a behavioral continuum. So they didn't just start when we started making stone tools. They probably existed as far back as when we were using stone tools, and perhaps most certainly when we were using plant tools. So, and we think potentially our common ancestor, so whoever the great-great-grandparent of chimpanzees and humans were, they were likely using plant tools and likely had these behavioral attributes as part of their sort of day-to-day lives. They may have applied to lots of other things as well. Okay, changing a little bit up. As I said, most of my research has been about chimpanzee tool use and chimpanzee culture. And it's hard, or it's impossible, when you're sort of working with these wild communities and observing them, being in the forest with them every day, to not care about them and their lives and their survival. Chimpanzees, the species, the chimpanzee species is classified as endangered by the IUCN Red List. However, Western chimpanzees are on sort of are critically endangered. So in the last 25 years, there's been an 80% decline. And most of the drivers of this decline are sort of commercial activities, things like industrial logging, plantations like palm oil plantations, just becoming a big industry now that it's moving away from Southeast Asia. Or expanding from Southeast Asia, and also mining. Guinea is one of the biggest reserves of iron ore and bauxite. Bauxite is what it goes into producing aluminum, which is, of course, something that exists in many products today. Interestingly, both aluminum and palm oil are some of the most efficient products of their category. Palm oil is, in terms of how much it produces per land unit, is the most efficient compared to other forms of oil. And the same with, well, in the case of aluminium, it's a material that can be recycled, and it doesn't lose property value. So in theory, it could be recycled infinitely, and you could use it. However, with aluminium, it's still many cases where it's cheaper to get more than recycle it, which is something that that is hopefully changing, but it's something that needs to change as we move forward as well, with sort of electric cars and other production happening. And so these are kind of the main impacts, but there is also sort of indirect impacts of mining and other commercial activities. Some of them are like noise pollution, chemical pollution of the land around it, and also zoonosis events. So diseases being transmitted from humans to animals. Poaching can also become a big thing when these areas attract larger populations and populations growing. And of course, the danger of roads is something that we know for many species, not just primates, of course. Now, in addition to impacts on local wildlife, these commercial activities also do have some impact on human livelihoods. And this was some research that I did as part of study that I was doing on a neighboring field site to Bossou, which I will go over in a little bit. But basically, a lot of the research I looked at showed that there were some positive impacts of having these commercial activities happening in the region. Of course, it can improve social infrastructure, access to roads, access to schools, hospitals, and so on. But also if the local community gets employed, then it can be a source of stable income and food security. However, when you look at some of the negative aspects of it, it shows that often these companies may be paying us insufficient or unreliable wages. There have been news reports for Guinea specifically, and for the region where Bossou is and other field sites, is that the companies aren't paying regularly. So many companies make huge profits, but wages are not matched by the increase of demand. They're often not paid in time. There's also potentially poor living and working conditions. I know, let me see if this is showing. Okay, yeah. These are in French, but I will give you, these are just some news articles of the different things. So there were recently, well, not so recently now, but there were protests against sort of the oil palm, the main oil palm company, because there were 3 months of wages in arrears, but also factory workers were on strike for a logging company because of unsafe working conditions. So they were being asked to work in the factory with no protective equipment and so on. There's also evidence that there's low dietary diversity for people who live from working for these companies and don't have sort of their own land to grow their own vegetables and so on. And again, the expansion of companies or wanting to have land for their developments means that there's loss of land to the local community. Things like mining, in many cases, we know that can cause soil infertility because of the different chemicals that are coming out as a result of it, and then also reduced access to clean water. So in Guinea, in particular, the quality of life remains very low. The majority of inhabitants in the region where Bossou is live on $850 per year. And there are cases that there is some, the younger children and so on are suffering from malnutrition. And the threats to these, the loss of indigenous land and soil infertility and clean water has led to actions from local youth groups, local environmental youth groups, such as this one called Touche pas ma forêt, which means don't touch my forest, who are actually actively protesting against companies like Forêt Fort, which is the logging company, Sogipa, which does the oil palm plantations. And they were sort of and protesting also against the environmental and socioeconomic damages that they cause. And I want to give you sort of a bit more of a detailed example of this briefly from some research I did in a chimpanzee field site that was close to Bossou. This was a field site not far away, about 50 kilometers away in the DK forest. This chimpanzee community hasn't been studied very much. Really only just a few surveys have happened there over the past few decades. However, we know that they do have a nutcracking tradition, which is different from Bossou. So they use bigger stone tools, different types of stones, and they also crack different species of nuts. So they don't crack oil palm, they crack panda and kula nuts. So very different tradition, very different, slightly different culture. We don't know much more other than their population is around 25 to 253 individuals, a very wide estimate, but it's what you can calculate based on nesting surveys. And this is from 2011, so there hasn't really been another survey on population size since then, really. So as similar to, Guinea, you can see the map of Guinea, the Eke, is here. The Eke is here, and then Gombe, Bossou is this black dot there. So that was the field site I was working at, and then I came to this site here, which is much bigger. But basically this region, Dieke Forestière, which is the region of Guinea where these sort of several chimpanzee field sites are in, it's the second lowland evergreen forest So Dieke is the second largest lowland evergreen forest in this region. It's also one of the largest near pristine forest mosaics and a key biodiversity area for West Africa. So not just for chimpanzees, but for lots of other species, including birds and invertebrates as well. However, it is the third protected chimpanzee site that is most affected by encroaching human activities out of this whole region. 25% of this region is affected by deforestation, as you can see in sort of this first slide here. So that's 25, yes, I said that, 25%. Dieke itself is surrounded by oil palm and rubber plantations. So that's Dieke there. You can see the very huge density of those plantations there, which are controlled by this oil palm society. And there are also active mining concessions both to the east and the south of this area, as is, in Bossou is quite there, right in the middle of that. And it's expected to yield around 1.2 billion tons of iron ore. So we went to this area of Dieke to kind of get a sense of what, if chimpanzees were still there, if they were still cracking nuts. Initially, this was more of a sort of expedition to get a sense of whether I could go there and expand my research on nut cracking to this area. And that wasn't possible, but what we found was something that we thought would be worth reporting. So what we did is we surveyed two areas, one sort of in the forest and one just outside the forest in what is called the buffer zone. And we compared basically the data we collected to data that a researcher had done previous, sort of 10 years ago. So this was 10 years later, we went back to the same areas and did sort of a similar survey. So in this first area in the forest itself, this is data from 2006 and 2009. We have sort of 12 traces detected and then 16 traces, sort of a good diversity there of different things, direct sightings, lots of nests, 6 and 7, feeding traces and so on. However, when we went there in 2018, we only have 3 traces, 2 traces of nut cracking, but these were already 1 year old. And 1 nest of a similar age. So it seemed like chimpanzees hadn't been in the area for at least 1 year. In comparison, the buffer zone area, which is just outside the forest, in 2006, this is quite a whopping number, 25 nests in that area documented. But then in 2009, again, 7, and then it gets even lower with 4. And we're not even sure if these are actually chimpanzee traces because they were just sort of trails in the forest. So it could have been another animal, which means that then there would be nothing. In between these two, basically in these 10 years, this area, which used to have forests, had been converted completely to cultivation fields, which probably explains why there were no chimpanzees or not many traces of chimpanzees there. When we looked at the nut cracking, as I said, we found 2 traces or 2 sites with traces, but these were 1 year old. Most of the things that we found, just for a comparison here, were covered in moss. Really hard to identify traces of nut cracking by this point compared to sort of the 2009, where there was clear sort of nutshells and other things that could help us identify what the tools were and where they were. We thought maybe it could have to do with the fact that there were no more tools available at the site, or no more rocks, or the trees were no longer healthy and not producing nuts. But we found that all the trees in the area were producing nuts, and they had more than 50 sort of suitable stones that they could use. So it seems like an ecological explanation for the absence is unlikely, and also combined with the fact that there weren't many traces of chimpanzees suggests that at least in that particular part of the Dieke forest, chimpanzees were dwindling in numbers. And this trend was also found for other mammal species, sorry, not just mammals, but other species, so primates and small sort of antelope species, so something like the duiker here, had, well, especially these had a really big drop between the published data from 2011 alongside sort of other small primates and chimpanzees. And then when we looked at traces of human activity, there was this big, I mean, hunting was already really, really high, but then it was incredible. Like what we recovered in 2018 was huge. So 3 times higher than the numbers recorded in 2011. And this is just an example of all of the things that we found. In the 6 days that we were there, we recovered 116 bullet casings, 18 snares and traps. Many of them were still set, so hunters were still going through there regularly to hunt for mammals and other. 3 hunting camps as well we found, and in the night we heard 4 gunshots during the first 2 nights. So already, as I said, in 2009, and then of course the data from 2011 shows this, there was a high incidence of hunting pressure in this area, but it indicates that this has continued and is on the rise and could be, well, potentially is probably the main factor affecting chimpanzees in the area. So they might not be actively causing death of the chimpanzees, but it could be that chimpanzees are moving away from the area because of the impact, the sound, the noise, and everything else that basically brings danger into the region, and they're moving to safety. So Dieke isn't the only site that's in crisis. The Bosu chimpanzees, and it saddens me to think about this because, of course, I've studied them for so long. And when I was there, already there were only 7 chimpanzees during my PhD because in the early 2000s, there was a respiratory illness that went through the population, probably transmitted from humans that were in the forest. And so that population, which was over 20 strong, plummeted to 15 and then just never recovered. So slowly older individuals died off. Some individuals sort of moved to other places. We don't know where they went to. And as of today, so the last trip that I went to, there are only 3 left. So this is really sad and devastating thing to consider given the deep history that this site has had. And it sort of is an omen to what other chimpanzee communities might be facing. However, conservation is actively trying to preserve lots of different chimpanzee species. And even though, chimpanzee communities, and even though Bosu chimpanzees are unlikely to recover because there's nothing really we can do. We can't really introduce chimpanzees. We have to introduce a huge number of them. The forest is too small really to support many at that point, and there's lots of other things happening now in the evolving political situation that makes it quite complicated. However, one of the things that I have been working on over the last few years is trying to preserve the cultural legacy of the Bosu community, and not so much, well, both to kind of preserve it for posterity, but also for Bosu to be a symbol or a message to anyone interested in chimpanzees to kind of learn about their culture, but also learn how they can potentially conserve other chimpanzee communities that are facing similar threats. So I've been collecting and documenting all the different sort of cultural traces and cultural behaviors of chimpanzees. But it's not just an exercise of preserving culture. Culture also has importance for conserving chimpanzees. So we know from sort of research that is happening in the last decades that behavioral diversity in chimpanzee communities can actually be very important for building resilience. So the more diverse a chimpanzee community is in terms of their behaviors, it means that they can better adapt to the fast-pacing, changing environment around them, whether it is from human pressure, whether it's from climate change, and they can adapt to sort of new fruits, new foods that are being introduced, even if their forests may be getting smaller. We know there are, at some sites, for example, chimpanzees have started nesting in trees that are unfamiliar to them. So they're kind of adapting in those different ways. But also there's an aspect of human connection. So as I said, the Bosu community sees chimpanzees as their ancestors, but they are not the only ones. And thinking about conservation in that context of the value that it has, the cultural value that primates have, chimpanzees and other primates have to human communities, but also the value that they have in terms of our own heritage is incredibly important. Now I'm just going to finish quickly. And this sort of message or the importance of culture for conservation is becoming even more prevalent in sort of conservation narratives, really in the last sort of since the early 2000s. So I remember having a few meetings during the early pandemic years, discussing some of these things. And because of this value, so not just chimpanzees, but of course other species like elephants, whales, and so on, where culture is so important to their survival because they can able to transmit important knowledge, again, for this resilience and everything else. So these are things that are bringing new contexts and new ways for conservation to hopefully thrive and be more effective. So not just focusing on the usual measures, which are really important as well. So population size, genetic diversity, but adding a way of conserving cultural diversity and understanding how culture can support the conservation and preservation of those communities are things that are becoming ever more prevalent. And as part of this, I've been sort of part of this group now, the working group on chimpanzee cultures, is basically essentially seeking that, but specifically for chimpanzees, where we're sort of a community of specialists promoting multidisciplinary approaches to conservation by looking at the communities, the chimpanzee communities, their cultural heritage, habitats, and also the communities that live in those environments. So bringing all of those things together to hopefully preserve chimpanzees and celebrate them, celebrate their cultures, and hopefully have them live on for generations to come. I want to finish, and I thought this would be fitting to finish with a message of hope from Jane, because I know that conservation isn't easy and it's hard to see the light sometimes. But I think this is something that, especially in what's happened recently with her passing, that it's really important to remember that we need to hold on to hope, because hope is what keeps us going. Hope is what keeps us fighting. And together we can create a future for living things. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Kat. This is brilliant. We might have time for maybe one or two questions from the audience. And if I could get you to repeat the question in your answer, that would be fantastic.
Hello. Yes. Yeah. So that was just the Western chimpanzees. Yeah. So the Guinea, Ivory Coast, that sort of area. Yeah. That's a good question. That's so sorry, I'll repeat the question. So the question was whether, I'm assuming the question is going to be what is the human impact in Tanzania and yeah, as opposed to what was happening with the Western chimpanzees. That is happening there as well. However, the protection of those species is better controlled is the wrong word, but there are a lot of things in place that are protecting them. There's the National Park Services and so on, who are really both have funding and have more of established park boundaries, which means that those populations are better preserved. There's also a lot more work in terms of working with local communities. And this also connects to things like political and economic stability. So especially in places like Tanzania and Uganda. Of course, for bonobos in the Democratic Republic of Congo, that is different because of political instability is quite a big challenge, and Guinea is one of those places. So there are differences in terms of the level of conservation, definitely, and some communities, those that are also better studied in general, are better preserved, but every site is facing similar pressures, just at different scales. Yeah. Yeah, no problem. At the back, yeah.
Thank you. I'm just wondering how you define technology. Sorry, I missed it, but lots of different animals use tools.
Yeah.
And several of them make them farm.
Yeah.
So where do you draw the line in terms of saying that those species can farm?
Thank you. So the question is, how do I define technology? Because there are many species that use tools and many species that make tools. This is a great question. Actually, someone asked this at a conference recent, not to me, and then I didn't think about what the answer would be. But I think I try and think about things in terms of evolutionary continuity. So for me, when I think about tool use, tool making, those things to me are part of technology. So even if they just use tools, it's a way that you're extending your body to solve a problem in your environment. So I wouldn't say that. So example, nest construction. Is it technology? Is it tool use? I would kind of say that it's the same. Like I wouldn't draw a differentiation between technology and tool use, and maybe there's a semantic English isn't my first language, so maybe there are other definitions. And when you think about the archaeological definition of technology, then it's very specific. But I think taking this broader species inclusive definition, tool use, technology, there are differences, of course, whether you're making tools or using tools. That to me is a more important difference. However, both of those have value when you're thinking about what do they mean really in terms of behavior and how animals think, right? As the nut cracking, for example, that's not tool making, they are using tools. But you can still learn a lot about, they understand the mechanical properties of the rocks they're using. Then with the termite fishing, they are making tools, they are manufacturing tools, which they are different, but you can still learn a lot from both. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Brilliant. Afterwards. And now I will stand next to Kat on her microphone, and I would like to thank her once again for this amazing, amazing talk. We have a round of applause, please.